Good afternoon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction. We have here today two historians and a journalist activist on our panel. In your program, it did say that there was another historian, Avi Schleim, who would be on the stage today. Unfortunately, he's unable to speak, but we do hope that he will be speaking at some more events in the festival, so you'll get a chance to hear him then. This session is to talk about coexistence. It seems to be a tall order in the current world, but on my left here is a professor who has written a whole book about coexistence and its history. Ussama, can you start us a little bit, just a little bit about your own personal background and how you got involved in this subject area, in this conflict?
Yes, well, of course, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone and to William for the opportunity to speak. I mean, obviously, I'm a historian of the Middle East. I'm Palestinian, Lebanese. I grew up in Beirut. My mother is Palestinian. And the idea of coexistence, I lived during the Lebanese Civil War, and the idea of coexistence as something that is obvious, that is normal, that is natural, that is evident to me was clear. And yet the way the Middle East, the way the Arab world has been represented as a place of sectarianism, as a place of communalism, as a place of unending violence was completely and utterly mischievous and wrong. I knew that, and so I spent my career working on historicizing, thinking about sectarianism, thinking about why is it that people today think of Muslim-Christian conflict or Muslim-Jewish or Arab-Jewish conflict in completely ahistorical terms. There is no such thing as an Arab-Jewish conflict that goes back before the 20th century, really. There is really, there's so much history that we need to uncover. There's so much humanity and beauty and of coexistence that we need to think about seriously. And the reality is that in the Western world, and Western powers and colonial powers have made it a big business to basically essentially say that people in the Middle East, whether Muslims or Christians or Jews, Arabs or non-Arabs, can only get along with Western colonial control. And the reality is, just like India, just like many other parts of the world, there are extraordinary histories of coexistence that have been denied and covered up and obscured. And we need to study them and be more honest about them without succumbing to extraordinarily Orientalist representations of the Middle East, of the Arab world, of the Palestinians, of the Lebanese, of Arabs, of any people, frankly.
Thank you. Noah.
Same question?
Yes, same question.
Okay. My background is I'm a Yemeni Jew. My family, where to begin? My family was, manipulated into emigrating to occupied Palestine. I've since renounced that citizenship. But the history of Arab Jews, specifically Yemeni Jews, goes back over 2,000 years to Yemen, where there was coexistence and obviously periods where there was more tension than others, but the coexistence was there. And I don't believe in the false polarity between Arabs and Jews because you're looking at one. So that premise is just false. And Avi Schleim, who couldn't speak on the panel today, is an Iraqi Jew, and there's another example, and there's plenty of us. So I think that's a good starting point for this discussion.
Thank you. And around 50% of the Jewish population of Israel are of Arab descent, aren't they?
I would say that they're Jews from Arab and Muslim lands.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask William about his background because I think you know. But what I am going to ask William about is the history of peaceful coexistence between Arabs and Jews and Christians, I should add, because they weren't on the title of the session.
Yes, forgive me, I'm a slight fraud on this panel in that I'm not Avi Schleim, forgive me. And I wish I could be as great a writer as Avi and write the wonderful books on the Middle East. I have a whole shelf of them at home, up to his most recent one about Gaza, which is a fantastic read if anyone wants to understand the current conflict. But I have spent 5 years in the Middle East writing a book called From the Holy Mountain.
Wonderful book. If you haven't got it, very much worth reading.
And it was a book about the Christians of the Middle East who are often forgotten. Ussama, sitting to my left, is one of them. And despite having the same name as Osama bin Laden, is a Christian. And these are things that people do not understand when they come to the Middle East for the first time, nor do they understand that Christian Arabs call God Allah, which is a surprise to people who come into this world from beyond. And between 1994 and 1997, I traveled among the different Christian communities in the Middle East, and was astonished how far the history was different from, as Ussama says, this line that we're fed about communities in constant conflict. This is on two different levels. If you read a quick history of the Middle East, it sounds like a succession of cataclysms that you have crashing down on this piece of land. The Philistines, the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. And you get the impression that there is a wipeout every time that these successive rulers come through, ending through the Arab Umayyads to the Ottoman Turks. But DNA tests show conclusively that both Israelis and Palestinians have long, deep roots in the soil, that there are, particularly among the Christian Palestinians, because they are virtually a homogenous group that have not married out much, that there is something like an 85% crossover of the DNA with those dug up from Bronze Age skeletons in the same region. So the history that you read of Assyrians and Babylonians and massacres hides a history of continuity of these people in the soil. And on top of that, the impression that you get when someone like the President of America makes a statement that these are regions which have been in constant conflict for, did he say 3,000 years? This is nonsense, because if you look at the history, it is an astonishing example of communal coexistence. The biggest surprise, I think, to anyone that doesn't know the history is if you look at the history of the Arab invasions in the 6th century. There is an impression given, particularly in Israeli history books, that there is a sort of cataclysmic arrival of men on camels from Mecca, wiping out the indigenous inhabitants and taking over. In reality, archaeologists talk about this as the invisible conquest, because one of the only ways that you can tell the difference in areas, particularly around in the Jordan Valley, from before and after, is that more churches are built after the Arab conquest, when the Byzantines were not crushing the Syriac and the Monophysite and all the different minority Christian groups who were not Orthodox. And that what you find archaeologically is a growth in the number of churches after the Arab conquest. So it is one of the most surprising histories, and it is one which I've never been anywhere in the world where the history less that you're fed at school and the history that you see on the news less represents the reality on the ground. This long history of coexistence, this long history of peoples staying rooted in their villages and in their soils for century after century, which is not to say that there has not been moments of violence. And there are, famous pogroms against Jews, against Christians. For example, the Damascus riots in the 1860s, which Eugene Rogan, who was here last year, wrote about wonderfully well. There are these moments, and it's very important not to deny this, but these are interspersed by long eras of coexistence. And the biggest surprise, I think, when I was writing that book, was that Palestine doesn't become majority Muslim until the 12th century. In other words, for 600 years, it remains under Arab rule, a Muslim majority country. So I would encourage people to read this history, because it's hugely surprising. Sorry, what did I say? Yeah, sorry. To the 12th century. It is majority Christian, and it only ends up being majority Muslim after the Crusaders screw everything up in the 12th century. So the first Western intervention didn't go well. Anyway, more of that later.
Okay, so living, coexisting together across these communities was a norm, and I can quote from the 14th century Iranian poet Hafez, who says, "I'm in love with every mosque, church, shrine, and temple, because there is uttered the name of the one God." Ussama, when did this peaceful coexistence begin to be in question?
Well, I mean, William just mentioned the Crusades. But of course, when we say coexistence, we mean, of course, a history that is variable. I mean, there are different forms of coexistence until the modern period, and actually even including in the modern period. The great problems, of course, as any modern historian will tell you, is colonialism, quite simply, Western colonialism, and of course Zionism in Palestine specifically, in terms of creating this dichotomy between being Arab and being Jewish. There is no such dichotomy beforehand. That's created as a result of Zionism and as a result of Western colonialism. And the thing I would say, quite honestly, in response to what William was saying, is that, of course, you use the word pogroms. I mean, I wouldn't use these terms to talk about the history of the Middle East. I think we should be faithful to the language and to the history and to the rhythms of people in the Middle East. Pogroms is a European term coming out of European history. Of course, there was violence against Jewish communities and violence against Christian communities and violence against Muslim communities of various sorts. And there were class divisions, there were social divisions, there were geographical divisions, there were many different kinds of divisions. But people in India, of course, will know this very well, given the history of British colonialism here. The idea that Westerners, with all due respect, and Western history is very complex as well, I don't want to simplify it in any way, but since I teach in the United States, it's extraordinary to me that people in the United States or in Britain or in France, where there's a long history, of course, of black, white violence or Protestant Catholic violence or all sorts of different forms of violence in Europe and in the United States, yet these people come, their historians come and give lectures to people in the Middle East, where there's a very long history of coexistence, as we've all agreed, that somehow there's something peculiar about the Middle East, even though there's an actual documented history of coexistence in all its forms that goes back centuries and centuries, and that is so deep, so obvious, and yet so vastly understudied. And so the idea, the last thing I'll say just in response, William, is to say that we should think of people in the Middle East not simply in terms of what their religion is. In other words, people are not just Muslim or Christian or Jewish. Despite what various political ideologies and colonial ideologies, such as Zionism and European colonialism and various other forms of ideologies insist, it's really important to understand that people are ideologically nuanced and different, and they can be different kinds of Muslims, different kinds of Christians, different kinds of Jews. And I think we lose sight of that when we conflate and we think of people in the Middle East only as one-dimensionally Muslim or Christian or Jewish. I think it's important.
I'd like to say that this is, of course, exactly the situation in India, where, you know, one of the main flaws of partition was that often a Bengali Muslim would have much more in common with a Bengali Hindu than he would with a Pashtun. And that religion is not necessarily the primary indicator of who you are or what you are.
And that partition occurred the exact same year as the establishment of the European colony known as Israel.
So is it a question of learning the tolerance of multiple identities, Noah?
Well, I have a problem with the term tolerance, right? Because that's such a low bar. So I'll say that. But I do want to comment quickly on the violence towards, thank you, the violence towards the Jewish communities, which I don't deny. But I don't think that we can talk about those without also mentioning the false flag attacks by, at the time, Zionist militant groups or terrorist groups before the formation of the State of Israel towards Jewish groups themselves. This happened in Baghdad, where Jews were 1/3 of the population. And this also was attempted in Egypt, something called the Lavon Affair, which the Egyptians stopped before it happened. And, you know, there are theories as to others which have not yet been proven. But, so you can't talk about the violence committed against Jews by certain communities without talking about the violence committed against Jews by Jews themselves. I don't think that's a fair historical perspective. And also I wanted to talk quickly, before I address your question, about the calculated demonization of the term Arab that was used to divide, we're talking about sectarianism, to divide, quote, Arabs and Jews. So the demonization of the term Arab, for example, my family does not identify as Arabs even though we're from Yemen, so that doesn't make sense at all. It's a geographical term or a cultural term, depending on how you want to look at it. So a new term was created called Mizrahi, which literally just means Easterner. That doesn't make sense at all. The capital of Libya is, the capital of Poland, for example, is farther east than the capital of Libya, so, it's just a nonsensical term. But it was because it was to replace the word Arab in the mouths of Jews in this new country. And in many ways, and other examples, like the names for Arabic for Jews were replaced. For example, Yemeni Arabic, the Jewish version that my family speaks, in addition to lingua franca Arabic, was replaced completely. We couldn't call it Arabic anymore. We had to call it Temanit, literally just Yemeni. And in any iteration of the word, of terms that had Arab or Arabic in it, were not allowed, right? It was banished from Jews' mouths. There was a constant and active demonization of anything that is considered Arab or Arabic adjacent, because that was the enemy. And so this kind of polarization was indoctrinated into Jews, and I think this is one of the roots of the problems with coexistence, which I think is great, but only one step above tolerance. And I think we can do much better than that. We should be able to thrive, because that's what happened. And that's what we were doing way before settler colonialism, which is Zionism is a version of.
Thank you. And just to clarify, are you saying that, in a way, anti-Semitism is a profoundly European invention?
Ussama, you're probably better qualified to answer that than I am.
That's a nice dodge.
Yes.
I mean, I think there's no question, there is absolutely no question, as a historian, speaking here as a historian, there's no question to me that almost all the histories of anti-Semitism that we study and we learn, and we have, of course, a distinguished Avishag here with us, or could have been with us and should have been with us, who's written about this. But there is no question to me that anti-Semitism, as every historian will tell you, every modern historian will tell you, in terms of racial anti-Semitism, emerges in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Zionism emerges, quite interestingly, not among the Jewish communities, whether in Yemen or in Iraq, Avishag's background, or in the Jewish communities of Syria or Lebanon or Palestine or Egypt or Morocco, or any of the Jewish communities that are indigenous to the Middle East. Zionism does not emerge there. Zionism emerges in Europe, responding to European anti-Semitism, and of course proposing a European solution, i.e. colonialism, in Palestine. And so I think when we talk about anti-Semitism, it's important to be honest and say, of course, there are moments and episodes of anti-Jewish discrimination and violence. As I said, there's also vastly more anti-Christian and anti-Muslim episodes in the Middle East. And the point is not to say one is better than the other. One is to historicize each and every moment of communalism or sectarianism, or whatever you want to call it. But anti-Semitism absolutely is not, the main problem in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, as William, I'm sure, knows, was not the Jewish question, because there was no Jewish question in the Ottoman Empire. There was a minority question, or an Eastern question. That is to say, how did European powers intervene in the Ottoman Empire with the pretext of trying to protect this or that minority community? There was an Armenian question. There were all sorts of other questions, but there wasn't an anti-Semitism question in the Middle East. There was an anti-Semitism question in Europe, and the Europeans, very cynically, attempted to resolve their anti-Semitism problem, of course, at the expense, as we know, as anyone who knows this history, at the expense of the Palestinian people, by making them lose their land, by expelling them from their land to make way for the creation of an exclusively ethno-religious nationalist project called Zionism.
And then, as Avi Schleim wrote in this rather extraordinary book, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, which is his own life story of growing up in Baghdad with his father, a very important merchant in Baghdad, and how suddenly, as a child, bombs started going off in Baghdad amongst the Jewish community around 1948, and there was an absolute panic. And as it turned out, his family moved to Israel, but were almost treated like second-class citizens because they were Arab Jews in what was effectively, at that stage, an Ashkenazi European invention. And for a long time, the Arab Jewish community lived in, as I said, as sort of second-class citizens. But it turned out that what was driving them...
Noah should
I just want to specify that those bombs were the false flag attacks set off by Zionists to encourage them to move to the newly found state of Israel. So
You beat me
Jews
to it.
bombing Jews, just so that's clear.
You should talk about your family's arrival in Israel, which you've told me about before.
William, please finish. I just wanted to specify who was setting off those bombs.
Yes, but and that's what I meant. Avi Schleim's rather remarkable book is great because it's a kind of detective story. He has done the detective work to find out who set off those bombs. And was this the same with your family?
No, but there was emissaries sent to Yemen to manipulate them into moving to this new European colony. And just, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is, but the nation was founded by European Jewry. And had they had enough European Jewry to populate the state and to fulfill their labor and demographic needs, they would not have wanted the Jews from majority Muslim and Arab countries. We were very much second class, if not third class, citizens because they wanted to populate the country, obviously, only with Jews and displace, if not worse, the Palestinian indigenous people.
Thank you. Now, Ussama, you rightly mentioned the fact that the word Christian doesn't come up enough in this conversation. And
Majority Muslim.
And you also talked to me earlier about massacres and the ecumenical reaction to massacres. Can you explain a little bit about that to everyone?
I mean, yes, in the sense that this is a very sort of arcane topic for most people, but the largest massacre, I wrote a book in part, but called The Age of Coexistence, and the largest massacre of Christians that took place in the Ottoman period in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire was in Damascus in 1860, in July 1860. And I was explaining to William earlier that in reaction to that, people had Christian Arabs who had been subject to a massacre in Damascus, and it had all sorts of economic and social and other reasons, sectarian reasons as well. I mean, it's a very complex affair that took place in July 1860, and a terrible moment. And of course, we should be honest about our history, and we should be critical about our history, and we should explore there should be no taboos in our history. Everything should be subject to historical analysis, precisely so that we don't make our history taboo or off limits. But the point is, the reality is that after that massacre in 1860, it's so interesting. First of all, during the massacres, it's so interesting that many Christian Arabs were saved by their Muslim neighbors. So yes, there were massacres, but what's interesting is that when you actually study the massacres to see how many Muslims actually saved their Christian
very much the story in partition here.
Yeah, I'm sure these are similar, because in the end, human beings are human beings, and we don't just operate on religious bases. And the point is, you operate on sort of neighborhoods, on kinship, on family ties, on friendships, on all sorts of ideas. And then after the massacres, what's so interesting is that Christian Arabs were at the forefront, and I'm not saying there's something special, but because they understood that the massacres had generated a lot of fear and anxiety among many Christians. And of course, the Western world then amplified these massacres and said, look how terrible things are in the Middle East. Look how barbaric these Ottoman Muslims are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Christian Arabs then had a choice. Would they then sort of give in to fear and communalism and sectarianism, or would they actually react by creating national ecumenical schools that were open to people of all faiths, that insisted that in fact it was in the power of each and every person to transcend religious and sectarian difference, and they did. And so the point is, again, it's a very minor point, but it's a hugely important point to say that Christian Arabs, like Muslim Arabs, like Jewish Arabs, have a choice to make between going to the darker parts of identity or going to the more ecumenical aspects. And what's so interesting is how many people, in fact, the normative ideas in the late 19th century, all the way until Zionism comes to Palestine, and the French in Algeria also separate Jews from Muslims. The interesting thing is how Arabs made choices, how many Christian Arabs made choices to in fact insist, and Muslim Arabs and Jewish Arabs went along with them, to insist on the idea that they actually belong to the same culture, to the same world. And hence, again, to a nod to Avi Shlaim's memoir, Three Worlds, the idea that you could belong to multiple worlds at once, and it's not about choosing one over the other, but actually reconciling them together. That was the history. That is a history that we need to recuperate much more so.
And one of the things that I found really striking in William's book, To the Holy Mountain, was how in Syria, Christian communities and Muslim communities actually worship in the same building, don't they?
So this happened all over the Middle East, and the Great Mosque of Damascus, which is the cathedral mosque, if you want to use a Western term, of Damascus, there was Muslims and Christians worshipping in that building together until I think the 12th century. Again, the Crusader period, this ends, and the Christians then go off and worship separately. But it was not, if you look at the early history of the Umayyad conquest, it is such an extraordinary story. The administration remains very much in the hands of Greek-speaking Christians. There's particularly a family in Damascus who are the head of effectively the civil service of the Umayyads. They are Christian. Sargon ibn, I can't remember the final name, who's the head of the Umayyad administration. And his grandson is the guy, St. John of Damascus, who at the end of his life takes the habit at the monastery of Mar Saba in the West Bank and writes the first Christian analysis of Islam, where he is not entirely clear that Islam is a different religion. He thinks it could be a Christian heresy related to Arianism, which was an earlier form of Christian belief, which minimized the godliness of Jesus, that Jesus was a man rather than the Son of God in the sense of a son rather than a direct part of the Godhead. I mean, the Byzantines loved these theological debates. And St. John of Damascus is, oddly enough, the man who saves Christian images. At this moment, there is iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire. All images are being smashed, partly in imitation so there's St. John of Damascus writes the defense of images under Muslim rule in a way that you couldn't have done in the Byzantine rule, which is why we have Christian images in churches all over the world today, thanks to this Christian Arab, crucial figure that no one ever knows about today. This does not die out in the 6th and 7th century. There's an incredible character called Tufik Kenan, who I'm sure Ussama has written about, who was an anthropologist, Ottoman official, going around, and he has recorded in his book Mohammedan Shrines and Sanctuaries of Palestine exactly what is very familiar to anyone in this room who's ever been to a Sufi shrine in this country, like Nizamuddin, where to this day you can go and see Hindu, Muslim, and Christian and Sikh all praying together without friction in the same shrine. This happened in Palestine in the 19th century and early 20th century. And though he writes about one place which I studied in particular, which was the monastery of St. George in Bet Sahur beside Bethlehem. And he said that the Christians call it the monastery of St. George, and they bring sheep there as a gift to St. George. The Muslims come with sheep and give it to the man that they call Khizr, the green saint. And the Jews, the Palestinian Jews, came there and brought sheep to the prophet Elisha. And all three would turn up. And I went and saw this place, having read this 19th century book when I was doing Holy Mountain. And this Muslim man did turn up on order carrying a sheep, which he gave to the Greek Orthodox monk. So this sort of thing survives, but of course now it's impossible for the Jews to come to that shrine because they are now separated politically and educationally, and they do not come anymore. But as recently as the 1920s and 1930s, this was a shrine, like in Nizamuddin, where three faiths worked together. And this was the norm, not the exception.
And Noah, the first clause in the governing party of the coalition in Israel, Likud's charter, talks about an Israel from the river to the sea and no Palestinian state. And so now by law, Jews have the exclusive right to the sovereignty of the state of Israel.
Well, it depends what are the borders of the state of Israel.
Indeed.
That's a bit contentious.
Particularly now, yes. So where does that leave us?
Oh, you give me the easy question.
Yeah.
Okay. Where does that leave us? Well, my views are a bit... I don't think my views are extreme at all. I believe in human rights for all. I believe in self-determination. And I believe in a Palestinian state that is not an ethnographically led... an ethno-nationalist one. I think it's pretty basic. I know that a lot of other people don't believe in that. And I believe that there is a continuing genocide, but I'm not sure that's the answer you were looking for. Do you want to be more specific?
Yeah, no, I'm
Okay.
intrigued.
I did want to make one comment about anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah.
My paternal lineage is Polish, although that's not clear from just looking at me. The Yemeni genes sort of ate the Polish genes. And so the experience of my paternal lineage in regards to anti-Semitism is very different than my maternal lineage. Because, as we were discussing earlier, that's not something they experience in terms of the modern definition of the word. So if we use terms like pogroms, which are accurate regarding my paternal lineage, they are inaccurate concerning my maternal lineage. There was a very famous incident in the 1700s, 1800s, called the Mausa exile, which did affect, in terms of like historicity. There was an exile of Yemeni Jews, particularly in Sana'a, which is where my family is from, and they were exiled for about a year. But if you talk about, not to diminish it, but if you talk about the plus over 2,000 years of Jewish coexistence in Yemen, that's not a particularly large amount of time. And again, I'm not diminishing it. So anti-Semitism as it exists as a European concept didn't exist when you're talking about Jews from Muslim and Arab lands, where Christians obviously existed as well. And so I don't think that we can apply it. And if you speak to the Jews from those lands, they will tell you themselves that is a European thing that was imported and adopted because of Zionism, because of post-World War II mentality. And I don't think that you can conflate the two things. And if they are conflated, it's because of an indoctrination. And I realize I've used that word twice now, but I'm using it pointedly.
Thank you, Noah. Ussama, we have the conflict raging even now. The ceasefire is not much of a ceasefire. We're about to hear today, supposedly, stage 2 plans for Gaza. Given this underlying inability of certainly the Netanyahu coalition to recognize any kind of coexistence, how do you believe we could step forward and evolve the situation in a more positive way?
Well, first of all, by telling the truth. I mean, there is a genocide that's taken place in Gaza. There is history. There is a present. There is a question of whether and how people want to live and on what basis. And first and foremost, the genocide has to stop. Inequality, discrimination, racism has to stop. Liberation has to come to, and as Noah, in that sense, Noah and I and William, I'm sure everyone here, we all agree. The idea is that people, it's not controversial. It shouldn't be controversial to say that Palestinians deserve freedom. It shouldn't be controversial to say a genocide must end. It shouldn't be in fact, it's actually our obligation to say a genocide has to end. And it should be very basic. I mean, it's not that difficult. So when you talk about solutions, the first solution is honesty and integrity and just saying the truth in the most basic way. Because if we can't talk about truth and we can't say things clearly without equivocation, then forget the idea of I'm not a politician anyway, so it's not for me to talk about politics, but I am a scholar and I'm a human being, and I really do believe people have an ethical obligation to tell the truth, especially in the face of the most extraordinary depravity of our age.
William, can I turn use the director's privilege to turn the question on you? Because you've been working for coexistence for 20 years now.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your work?
Well, I've been working with a rather remarkable man called Oliver McTurnan, who's a former Catholic priest, and he and I have been working...
Who married me.
Who married you and married me, but not to each other.
Not yet.
Not yet. His belief, he worked very closely with the people who helped resolve the conflict in Northern Ireland, is that the only way you will ever get any progress in this conflict is you must have all the leaders of all the constituencies round the table at the same time. And for those of you who know a little bit about the Northern Ireland conflict, we made an interim negotiated solution with Messrs Trimble and Hume, who were the moderates in Northern Ireland, and Messrs Paisley and Adams were excluded or self-excluded from the process. As a result, Messrs Trimble and Hume lost their political constituency almost overnight, and those political constituencies moved to Messrs Adams and Paisley. And it took some years before suddenly on the front pages of the newspapers, Messrs actually McGuinness and Paisley were seen shaking hands, and we all thought it must be April Fool's Day, and it wasn't. And in a way, that is the model. What I've learned from Messrs McGuinness and Paisley is that they learned everything from the South Africans, from the ANC and de Klerk. And so my little organization has been working to try and get the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership to learn from the Irish, who learned from the South Africans, to kind of pass the baton, as you might say. I mean, the whole area of Israel-Palestine is about 2/3 the size of Rajasthan. And yet, in that area, that size, the top 1,000 people who run the state of Israel and the top 1,000 Islamists on the Palestinian side have never met. Not once, except possibly in prison. And so the only way in which this conflict will get resolved peacefully is for people to sit around the table and talk. And that seems to me to be pretty straightforward, pretty commonsensical, and you need the leadership of all of these different constituencies to talk at the same time. We seem to be as far away as possible from that, and it's certainly been the policy of at least one side to, or maybe both sides at their extremes, to demonize each other. And of course, if you demonize each other, you can give people horns and a tail. You can suddenly deny them their humanity, their mutual experiences of life, parenthood, and priorities that they would have for each other's lives. In my experience of trying to bring these people together, once people actually find each other's humanity, then that's the beginning of the journey. But until that happens, until these people are forced, maybe by the rest of the world, to engage with each other, no progress, I believe, can be made. George, you're better than war. And the irony about the current Trump plan to resolve Gaza is that the only people who haven't been consulted in this plan are the Palestinians. And the Palestinians are not to be allowed to govern themselves. As you know, they did elect a government in 2006. And the one thing that came out of that was, we will not engage with your democratically elected government. And I think the one last thing I would like to get across is there isn't one Arab regime that would like to see a democratically elected Palestinian state, because that would pull the rug from underneath their own regimes. So for the poor, benighted Palestinians, every single powerful organization, country, everything else is pretty much against them.
Except for world opinion, and except for the fact that the vast majority of the Arab world, I would say the vast majority of the Islamic world, the vast majority of the third world, including, of course, in India itself, I hope. I mean, there's a long history in India of solidarity with Palestine and with liberation. There's a whole history out there and a whole reality, a present reality of people who have actually stood up for what is right and what is just and what is decent. And just one last point, William, in response, it's not just talking with each other. You talk on the basis of something. The basis has to be equality or liberation for everyone. But fundamentally, you have to talk about equality. That has to be the basis of
Equity.
anything. What?
Equity versus equality.
Equality, first and foremost. Not even equity, but equality, right? Just basic political equality. That has to be the fundament of anything. Otherwise, what are we talking about?
And the rest is silence. Thank you very, very much indeed.